More often than not, siblings who are born almost a decade apart are not super close in their childhood. The age difference is just too much to overcome for children. That was not the case with 14-year-old Nancy Eagleson and her 5-year-old sister Sheryl. Sheryl looked up to her sister and loved being around her, and Nancy enjoyed spending as much time as possible with Sheryl. Nancy was basically a second mother to Sheryl, and the two were together all the time. At the same time, Nancy was growing up, and she was starting to desire more adult-type things. One of those things was her first pair of high-heel shoes. According to a short book written by her mom, Betty, Nancy had spent several months begging and pleading for a pair of high-heel shoes so she could let all the boys around her here in the little town of Paulding, Ohio, know that she was growing up.
Betty kept telling her no. The family was not well off, and those shoes would be a luxury purchase that they simply could not afford. But teenagers have a way of really pushing for things that they want, and Nancy was no different. After several months of hearing Nancy beg for those shoes day after day, finally Betty gave in. The two of them went shopping, and Nancy picked out her first pair of what she called, quote, clacky clack shoes, end quote. They weren't super tall like the ones adult women wear. They were probably half size, but they were tall enough for Nancy to think the boys would notice.
That was Saturday, November 12th, 1960. One of the best days of Nancy's life. The day when she finally got that one thing she had begged for and wanted for so long. As the sun set on that wonderful day, it must have been hard for Nancy to sleep, knowing her shoes were there waiting for her near her bed. She knew when she woke up in the morning she'd be able to put them on and wear them to church for the first time. Saturday, November 12th, 1960, the last full day of Nancy's life. According to an article on WTOL.com, Sunday was 10 degrees warmer than normal, one of the final warm days before a long, cold, Midwestern winter would arrive. Nancy and Sheryl attended church here at the Church of Christ. After the service, they were messing around and playing with the other kids. Time slipped away, and before they knew it, their ride was gone.
It was the 13th of the month, so Nancy jokingly told a friend, quote, the 13th must be my unlucky day, end quote. Thankfully, their home was just a short 7-minute walk from the church. Plus, Nancy didn't mind walking a bit. It gave her a chance to show off her new shoes. Betty watched out the window and saw the two sisters walking down the road in front of the house, holding hands, swinging their arms, laughing and singing. Later that afternoon, the girls went to see a movie. Afterwards, they got a soft drink at a local restaurant, then they walked over to see their dad at the bowling alley where he worked on weekends. By this time, Nancy had realized something about high-heeled shoes. They weren't exactly comfortable. She asked her dad for a ride home. He said if they'd wait a bit, he'd be able to take a break and give them a ride home. But Nancy was ready to go home, so the girls decided to walk. After all, it was only a 12-minute walk back to the house from the bowling alley.
So, just before 7:30 p.m., they held hands and walked down the road. Several minutes later, they crossed this bridge, leaving downtown and heading toward their house. When they were about 8 houses away from their house, Sheryl noticed a large black car behind them. She whispered to Nancy that she thought someone was following them.
At that point, they crossed to this area here, where a gas station used to be, and ended up on Flat Rock Drive, where they lived at the time.
And that's when they were able to confirm that someone was indeed following them. The car pulled up next to them. Inside the car was a nicely dressed man. Sheryl would later say it looked like he was coming home from church. He had on a suit, a tie, he had a fedora on, and he had thick black glasses. He asked if they needed a ride. They said, no, thank you. He pulled off. He circled back around. He said again, are you sure you don't need a ride now? They said, no, thank you. He pulled up in front of them, parked, got out of his car, grabbed Nancy, started to throw her into the car, at which point Sheryl jumped on his back. He turned around, hit her in the stomach, and threw her onto the ground and was able to force Nancy into his car. It's been more than 60 years since this happened. This case has not been solved to this day, but the case, unlike many cases from back then, does remain open and active, and police are hoping to solve it soon. This is Twisted Crimes.
After church that day, The family had eaten lunch together. Then it was time for Mom and Dad to head off to work. Dad Donald, who went by Don, had a full-time job during the week, but he also had a second job taking care of a bowling alley that was located in this building at the time. Betty also had a second job on the weekends working at a drive-in theater. The girls walked downtown and headed to the Paulding Theater to watch a double feature. One of the movies they watched was David and Bathsheba, starring Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward, which was showing in a limited release that day. The Paulding Theater doesn't look like much now, but bits and pieces of its past glory can still be seen. The marquee was filled with lights all around the outside of it as well as underneath it. There were plenty of areas for posters advertising what movies were showing at the time.
Sheryl would later tell WTOL that the sidewalk in this area here outside the theater had little sparkles embedded in it. It was a cool spot to be in town. Sheryl said at the time it was a beautiful place. Sheryl, though, was too young to really enjoy the time at the movies. She said she spent most of her time in the theater sleeping. When she was awake, she was moving all around in her seat, but she was excited for what would come after. They were heading to Johnson's restaurant where she'd be able to pick out a soda to enjoy.
The girls knew the owner, Virgil Johnson. They were friends with his daughter. They enjoyed their drink, then left and made the short walk past the theater and over to the bowling alley to see their father. They hung out at the bowling alley for a bit, asked for a ride from their dad, then began their walk home. Their father watched the two girls walk out, hand in hand, with no way of knowing he'd never see Nancy alive again. Despite being only 5 years old at the time, Sheryl remembered several things about the attack. She remembered the man had a belly like Santa Claus. She remembered he reached into his pocket while holding on to Nancy with his other hand. She remembered she had smelled something weird while she was holding onto his back, trying to pull him off of Nancy. She remembered he was driving a large black car. She remembered the suit, tie, fedora, the thick black glasses. She remembered the man had dark hair, but gray was starting to creep in. She remembered that her sister did not seem to be moving once she had been thrown into the back seat of the car. She even guessed that the man was probably a bit older than her own father, who was 39 at the time. Police would later say perhaps the weird smell was alcohol, or perhaps the man had chloroform that he had used to knock Nancy out, or perhaps the smell was a combination of alcohol and chloroform. Sheryl watched the car drive away, with her sister lying still in the back seat. She ran as fast as she could run to the home of John and Betty Larson, who were neighbors of the Eagleson family. They had also been babysitters for Nancy and Sheryl on many occasions. John and Betty later told the Lima News that they were inside watching the TV show Dennis the Menace when Sheryl came bursting into their house crying and screaming and telling them a man has Nancy. They ran outside, but they did not see anyone and did not see the black car. So they called the police. A massive search began.
Joseph Offrance and Kenny Nelson were avid hunters, so avid that they decided to head into these woods here, about 9 miles northeast of the Eagleson home, with their dog to go raccoon hunting at 2:30 in the morning on Monday, November 14th, 1960. They parked their car out here on the road, grabbed their guns and flashlights, then sent the dog out ahead of them into the woods.
One of the men would later tell the Lima News, "We heard the dog running through the woods, barking and obviously on scent. We were in the woods when we heard the dog whine, then back away, then again approach a spot about 100 feet off the road. The men then carefully made their way toward the dog, shining their light in that direction. At that point, they noticed what they first thought was a discarded Halloween costume. But it was not a Halloween costume. It was the body of Nancy Eagleson."
At that moment, a highway patrol officer who was searching for Nancy was coming down this road, and he noticed the car parked in the road. He slowed down, then he saw two men running out of the woods holding guns. He quickly stopped his car to see what was going on. The men told the officer what they had found. Soon, other police officers arrived, and the investigation began.
Police noticed a small hole in Nancy's head. The autopsy would later determine she had died from a wound that came from a small caliber bullet to the brain. Some strands of her long brown hair were found attached to various limbs and bushes in the woods. They would later say, based on the scene, It was obvious she had fought as hard as she could with the man despite being much smaller and weaker.
Undergarments were found near Nancy's body, and there were tire tracks from the car in the leaves. The massive search for the murderer continued throughout the day, but there were no signs of the man or his car.
Police knew right away the murderer was not a family member since Sheryl had seen the man and did not recognize him. So the first potential suspect they looked at was one of the hunters, Joseph Offrance. According to police reports, after finding Nancy's body, both Joseph and Kenny said they did not know who she was. However, a family member of Joseph's later said in an off-camera interview with WTOL 11 News that Nancy and Joseph's daughters were friends, and Nancy had spent the night at Joseph's house on several occasions. Also, the family member said Joseph's wife was surprised he was out and about for so long on the night when the murder took place. When he got home early that next morning, he quickly changed his clothes and headed to the sheriff's department for an interview. Before he left the house, he told his wife he was probably suspect number 1.
In a different interview, Joseph's daughter said her family took a vacation and stayed at a cottage by a lake sometime after the murder. She said during the trip, a girl who looked a lot like Nancy was staying nearby. She said Joseph got extremely drunk on the trip, got emotional, and was acting very strange throughout the trip. At the time, Joseph also looked similar to a composite sketch that was made of the suspect.
By Wednesday, November 16th, just 3 days after the murder, an investigator on the case told a reporter with the Sandusky Register that the case was, quote, pretty well at a standstill, end quote, which is a very strange thing to say so early on in the investigation and does not really give you much hope that the police had any clue as to what they were doing at the time.
According to the Evening Independent, at 2 p.m. on Thursday, just 4 days after Nancy and Sheryl had walked home from the Church of Christ, 500 people in this town of only 2,300 attended Nancy's funeral at the church.
Multiple police officers wearing plain clothes showed up at the funeral as well and mingled with the crowd. They checked all of the vehicles in the parking lot looking for a large black car. They looked around for a man matching Sheryl's description, thinking the killer may have wanted to attend the funeral. After the service, her body was taken to Live Oak Cemetery in Paulding, where she was buried. Police also attended the burial, looking around for the man or the black car. Police did not spot the man or the car. According to the Delphos Courant, rumors began to spread throughout the town that a local business owner was linked to the crime. Virgil Johnson, owner of Johnson's Restaurant, eventually figured out that the local business owner people were talking about was him. He quickly went to the police and told them that he had an alibi. He said he was actually at the Paulding Theater with his wife watching a movie when Nancy was taken. He also volunteered to take a polygraph, which he passed. On December 2nd, he was cleared by the police of any involvement in Nancy's murder.
Let's talk about Sheryl for a minute. Take a moment to put yourself in her shoes. 5 years old, best friends with her sister, is actually there and watches her get taken by this evil man. Mom Betty told Lima News, quote, "We've had her to several doctors, but nothing has helped. We took her to see Dr. Donald Schneider in Payne for a series of hypnotic treatments, but after 2 seemingly helpful treatments, the third was a failure. Sheryl loved Nancy. They were inseparable, but Sheryl has changed now. She isn't a loving child anymore. She's afraid to get close to anyone emotionally for fear she might lose them as she lost Nancy," end quote. It didn't help that the murderer was still out there, and other scary things continued to happen in the days and weeks after the murder.
According to WTOL News, the family moved out of their home for a while after the murder. They lived with Sheryl's grandmother. Sheryl said she heard people talking about whether the murderer might return for her since she had actually seen him.
She told WTOL, quote, "I remember laying there and being scared to death. And I would call out for my mom to come and sit with me until I fell asleep. And that was fine until I would wake up in the middle of the night and realize I was alone, and I would be scared again. I thought for sure that he might come back and get me. And I thought, my mom and dad couldn't protect her. They're not going to be able to save me," end quote. She said one day she was in the kitchen at her grandparents' home when suddenly the back door flew open. Quote, "I screamed so loud, and my mom come running up to get me. She thought I cut myself, but she saw the door was open and immediately grabbed me off the chair and went to the other room to call my dad and my grandfather. They got the police and they came over and they found a knife or screwdriver on the back porch." End quote.
Eventually, the family moved back into their home on Flat Rock Drive. Sheryl said one day she picked up the phone and it wasn't working. Her dad figured out the phone lines had been cut, so he grabbed her and ran away from the house with her in his arms. The case quickly went cold. And to make matters worse, police somehow managed to lose much of the evidence in the case, including Nancy's shoe, dress, purse, scarf, and other personal belongings. Those things were supposedly being stored at the old jail, but disappeared in 1985. Since all that evidence was missing, the family decided to start up a GoFundMe page. The page said, "Because all the physical evidence was lost, we believe the only way to get answers is to do DNA testing on her remains. So, we have made the painful decision to exhume her body." According to the West Bend News, the request to exhume Nancy's body was granted on September 20th of 2022, thanks to a petition by family members. From October 24th through the 26th of that year, a new autopsy was performed. Unbelievably, a .22 caliber bullet was found with her remains in the casket that had somehow been missed all those years earlier, meaning she had actually been shot twice instead of one time as previously thought. They also found 5 small fibers with her body that had also been missed before. During this time, a .22 caliber revolver was handed over to police thanks to an investigation by WTOL 11 News. The man, Don Roanhouse, who had the gun, was a local in Paulding, and he claimed it was the actual gun used to kill Nancy. Police did do testing on the gun, but the results were inconclusive.
During the investigation done by WTOL, they found a local resident who had been through something similar to Nancy just a few years earlier. Cindy Geyer Keith told WTOL, quote, "It was getting close to dark, and I remember him cuffing my hands. He took the cuffs and pulled me backward and pushed me into the back seat of a car." End quote. She said he drove her to the jail, then he assaulted her at the jail. She said he was, quote, "holding a gun to my head," end quote. She couldn't remember the exact year it happened, but said it was around 1958 and she was around 8 years old at the time.
One thing she does remember is the man's name who did this to her, and that name is Claire Paulus, and he went by Bud. He was a deputy with the Paulding County Sheriff's Office at the time. On November 5th, 1987, a Paulding County grand jury indicted Bud for a different crime. He was accused of abusing a girl who was actually one of his family members. After the indictment, Bud decided he did not want to face his accuser. Police have no records of this happening, but WTOL was able to find the death certificate signed by a Dr. Don Snyder, giving Bud's date of death as November 6th of 1987.
The reason Cindy decided to come forward with her story is she believes Bud may have been the man who killed Nancy. She said he obviously had knowledge of the area where Nancy's body was found. He was a deputy, so he would have knowledge of guns, and he was abusing other girls at the time. He also ran a gas station with another man, Jack Vance, called Bud and Jack's Marathon Service at the time. It's within walking distance of the movie theater downtown.
Many residents and family members have said over the years they feel there has been a cover-up in this case by the sheriff's department. If Bud was the killer and all this evidence went missing, then that argument would make a lot of sense. Members of Nancy's family also told WTOL that on the night of the murder, while they were out searching for Nancy, Sheriff John Keeler told them to leave the area where her body was eventually found. He told them that area had been searched already. Bud was only mentioned once in the original case file, and that had to do with a complaint at his service station. Police showed up there to talk to him about a man who was acting strangely.
Cindy said she wasn't just abused by Bud that one time at jail. She said it happened multiple times and it went on for about 2 years. She was scared to tell anyone about it at the time because her family was so close to Bud's family. Bud's wife Virginia was even the maid of honor at Cindy's parents' wedding. Cindy said, quote, "Virginia didn't have any children, so we were kind of their substitute children, my brother Greg and I. They kind of lent us to them because they wanted children and didn't have any." End quote.
On October 6th of 2023, Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost released a public bulletin with a new sketch of Nancy's killer. The drawing was done by a forensic artist with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The artist had sat down with Sheryl to create the sketch. The bulletin says an image without facial features and one with generic features was created for reference. This is the original sketch from 1960. The fedora has been added to the new sketch, and his face looks larger as well. Sheryl said the 1960 sketch never felt quite right to her.
We've now reached the portion of the video where we're going to share our own thoughts and opinions on this case, starting with Heather.
I really think Claire Paulus, who went by the name of Bud, did this because he was previously convicted of assaulting one of his family members. And not too long ago, one of the women in the community came forward and said that he assaulted her as well.
He's a great suspect here in this case. There's also the whole cover-up idea that the family's been talking about for many, many years, and certainly that could play a role in it because of his role as a police officer here in town. The sheriff could have been trying to cover for one of his own men, destroyed or gotten rid of the evidence somehow or another, and then this whole thing could be an elaborate cover-up. I don't know why the sheriff would be covering for him other than the brotherhood idea that the police sometimes have, and that would be very, extremely unfortunate, really, in a case like this, if that was what was going on. I also hope they really looked into these guys that found Nancy's body out here in the woods. They're out here at 2:30 in the morning. They got their guns. Supposedly they're doing something to do with hunting. I don't know a lot about hunting. Heather's family's more into that. What reason would they have to be in the woods at 2:30 in the morning?
Maybe they were tracking a deer, but typically you would wait until morning time to do so.
Yeah, it's just really strange that they would be out here doing that at 2:30 in the morning. And so hopefully, I'm sure they did look into those guys. Hopefully they did fully look into those guys. But there are several other candidates, several other potential suspects in this case. And I don't think we're really necessarily going to have an answer to this until that DNA is used and matches someone, and then they'll know for sure who did this. It sure would be nice for the sake of her sister to get some closure while she's still alive. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Anyone with information about this case is asked to call the Paulding County Sheriff's Office at 419-399-3791.